Cassandra had spent months preparing for this day. The wedding, which was meant to be the highlight of her life, was only a few moments away. The music began to play softly as she took her final steps towards the grand altar, her white gown swishing lightly behind her. The church was filled with the smiles and happy faces of her family and friends. Everything seemed perfect from the outside, just as it had always been planned. She had met Daniel a few years ago at a mutual friend's gathering. He was kind, handsome, and seemed to have everything in order. Good job, stable income, and a future that looked bright. From the moment they started dating, it felt like something right out of a romantic story. He treated her with the kind of care and attention she thought she deserved. He was always thoughtful, always there for her. Their relationship grew quickly, and after a year of dating, they got engaged. Everyone had congratulated them, and soon after, the planning began. The wedding was going to be a huge event. Their family had big expectations, and Cassandra could already imagine the elegant ceremony, the beautiful reception, and the social status that would come with it. Everyone said it would be the perfect match. But as she stood in the church gazing down the long aisle towards Daniel, something didn't feel right. She had dreamed of this moment for years. She had imagined walking down the aisle, smiling with joy bubbling inside her. Yet as she took each step, she felt a growing knot in her stomach. The closer she got to Daniel, the more uneasy she became. Something inside her was whispering that this wasn't the life she was meant to lead. Cassandra paused for a brief moment. She felt a wave of panic surge within her. The flowers in her hand suddenly felt heavy, and her breath became shallow. What was she doing here? What had she been thinking? This wasn't the future she had imagined. The excitement and warmth of love that should have filled her heart were nowhere to be found. Instead, she felt trapped in a story she didn't want to be a part of anymore. Her mind raced. She looked around at the people in the church, the friends who had supported her, the family who had worked so hard to plan this day. They all believed in this marriage, but she wasn't sure she could go through with it. Her heart was telling her one thing, but everything around her was pulling her in the opposite direction. Her dress felt too tight around her chest. Her hands were shaking, and she could feel her knees weakening. She stopped mid-step, her foot hovering above the next stone of the aisle. For a moment, Cassandra stood frozen, caught between two worlds. She had the future everyone expected her to have, the wedding, the perfect husband, the white picket fence. But it wasn't what she wanted. Her life had always been about pleasing others, her parents, her friends, society. She had never stopped to ask herself if this was truly the life she wanted. As much as she loved Daniel, she realized in that moment that love wasn't enough. There was something deeper she needed, freedom to live a life that felt like her own. The church grew quieter, almost too quiet. She could feel all eyes on her, waiting for her to continue walking, for the ceremony to proceed. But she couldn't move. Her legs were shaking, her heart was pounding, and her mind was screaming at her to stop. The decision was suddenly clear, and it was as though a door opened in her mind. She couldn't marry him. Not today, not ever. This wasn't her life. Without another thought, she turned around. The audience gasped. The murmurs spread like wildfire as Cassandra quickly made her way back down the aisle, her heels clicking against the marble floor, her mind racing with a mix of emotions. For a split second, she thought she might faint, but she kept moving, walking faster now, the noise of the room blending into the background. The door at the back of the church was only a few steps away. She pushed it open and stepped into the cool air outside, breathing heavily as she felt the weight of what she had just done. She didn't stop to look back. She didn't want to see the hurt or the confusion in her parents' eyes, or the disappointment on Daniel's face. It was too much. Her only focus now was the road ahead. She needed to get away, far away from everything that had led her to this point. The life she had been about to start had never truly been hers to begin with. Cassandra's heart was racing, but there was a strange sense of relief flooding through her. She was finally free. The burden she had carried for so long, of expectations, of plans that weren't hers, of a future that didn't fit, had been lifted. But as she walked through the churchyard, an overwhelming feeling of uncertainty crept in. Where would she go? What would she do now? She didn't have any answers, and she didn't know what the future held. Her mind wandered back to the small apartment she had been living in, the life she had built with Daniel, and all the people who would soon be looking for her. There would be a lot of questions. Everyone would want to know why. Why had she run away from her own wedding? It wasn't just the shame she would feel, but the truth that she didn't even know who she was anymore. For so long she had been defined by others, by her family's dreams for her, by society's standards of what was considered normal or right. Now, she had no idea who she was without those expectations. With no clear destination in mind, Cassandra found herself walking through the streets of the town, her feet moving on their own, her thoughts spiraling. She didn't know where she was headed, but she couldn't stay here. She couldn't go back. The thought of returning to that church, to the faces of everyone who had watched her walk away, was impossible to bear. She kept walking, not caring where she went, not caring who saw her. All she knew was that she had to leave everything behind. It wasn't just the wedding she had run from, it was a life she had never wanted. Her past, her present, and everything she thought she knew about herself had crumbled in that single moment when she turned her back on the altar. But as she walked, the one thing she knew for sure was that she couldn't go back to her old life. The only way forward was to go wherever the road would take her, no matter how uncertain or scary it might seem. She needed to find herself again, to discover who she truly was and what she really wanted out of life. So, with no destination in mind, Cassandra kept walking, feeling the weight of the world slip off her shoulders with every step. She didn't know what the future held, but she was ready to find out, on her own terms. Cassandra didn't know where she was going, but as her feet hit the pavement, she could feel her heart beginning to slow. There was a kind of peace in her solitude, even though she had no idea what to do next. The streets were quiet, and the air, though cool, felt refreshing against her flushed skin. She didn't look back at the church. She didn't look at anything but the path ahead. It was as if everything that had happened before that moment had no meaning anymore. She was alone in the world now, and in some strange way it felt freeing. She walked for what felt like hours, her thoughts heavy but clear. It was strange to think that just that morning, she had been preparing for the wedding, for a life that everyone expected her to lead. But in one swift decision, all of that had changed. There were no more plans, no more expectations. The only thing that mattered now was finding some kind of purpose, something to hold on to. As the evening sun began to dip behind the horizon, Cassandra found herself at the edge of a small town. It wasn't a big place, just a few homes scattered along a narrow road and some small businesses with signs that looked worn and tired from years of use. It wasn't a place that felt like home, but it was quiet, and she was grateful for the stillness. She needed a place to rest, to think, and maybe to gather her bearings before deciding what to do next. She wandered for a while longer, passing through the town without a clear direction. She wasn't sure if she was even looking for anything specific. Her body was exhausted, and the emotional toll of the past few hours had left her feeling drained. It was only when the sun began to set completely, casting long shadows over the streets, that Cassandra realized how lost she had become. She wasn't sure how she ended up in front of a small, run-down diner at the edge of town. The building looked like it had been around for decades. The flickering neon sign read, "Joe's Diner," with the words "home-cooked meals" beneath it. It was a simple, no-frills place, just like everything else in the town. She stood outside for a moment, staring at the sign before a strange urge took over. She was hungry, not just for food, but for something to ground her. She had to stop somewhere. Cassandra pushed open the door and stepped inside. The warm air and the smell of coffee filled the space, and she was immediately hit by the familiar feeling of small-town comfort. The diner was nearly empty, save for one man sitting in a corner booth, his head bent low over a cup of coffee. The waitress behind the counter looked up, her face creasing into a smile as she waved a greeting. "Hi there, hun. You look like you could use some food," the waitress said kindly, wiping her hands on her apron. "What can I get you?" Cassandra hesitated for a moment. It wasn't the kind of place she'd normally stop at, but right now, it felt like the right thing to do. "I'll have a coffee, please. And maybe a sandwich if you have one." The waitress nodded and poured her a cup of coffee, sliding it across the counter to her. Cassandra took the cup in her hands and felt its warmth seep into her skin. For the first time that day, she felt like she could breathe. The tension in her body started to ease, and she let herself relax into the moment. The diner, with its worn-out booths and retro vibe, felt like a place where no one was judging her. No one knew who she was or what had just happened. She took a sip of the coffee, its bitterness sharp against her tongue. The sandwich arrived soon after, and she ate slowly, savoring the simple comfort of food that wasn't tied to any expectation or responsibility. She didn't have to think about anyone else for a while. There was something strangely comforting about the solitude of the diner, the quiet murmur of the waitress as she worked, and the hum of the coffee machine in the background. It was as though the world outside had stopped spinning, and for once Cassandra was able to just exist in this small, peaceful moment. But as she finished her sandwich, the door opened and a man stepped inside. He was tall, his clothes disheveled and his face covered in a rough stubble. His eyes were tired and his movements were slow, as though he hadn't had much sleep in days. The waitress didn't seem to notice him at first, but Cassandra did. There was something about him that caught her attention immediately. Maybe it was the weariness in his eyes or the way he seemed to move as though he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Whatever it was, something inside her stirred. The man made his way to the counter and Cassandra couldn't help but overhear his conversation with the waitress. "You got anything to eat? Anything at all?" "I ain't picky," the waitress nodded sympathetically. "Got some leftover soup in the back. I'll heat it up for you." The man sat down on the stool across from her and for a moment neither of them said anything. Cassandra didn't want to intrude, but she couldn't stop herself from looking at him. There was a sadness in his eyes, a kind of exhaustion that seemed far beyond just physical tiredness. It was as if he had been carrying something heavy for a long time, something that weighed on his soul. After a while, the waitress brought him the soup, and the man dug into it with hunger. He didn't look up once as he ate, his focus entirely on the food in front of him. Cassandra, unable to stop herself, watched him quietly. There was something in his demeanor that seemed familiar. He looked like someone who had given up, someone who was lost in a way that Cassandra could relate to. When the man finished his soup, he placed the empty bowl back on the counter and let out a deep sigh. It was a long, heavy breath, as though he had just released a small portion of whatever burden he had been carrying. The waitress gave him a gentle smile. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft and kind. The man didn't answer immediately. He just stared down at his hands, his fingers trembling slightly. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough and low. "I'm just trying to make it," he said. "I got 3 kids at home, triplets. I'm doing the best I can, but it's hard. I'm barely keeping them fed, and I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. I haven't had a real meal in days." Cassandra's heart clenched as she listened to his words. She had heard people talk about hardship before, but something in his voice, in the quiet desperation that laced his words, struck her deeply. Without even thinking, she found herself standing up from her seat and walking over to him. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't mean to intrude, but I overheard you. You said you have 3 kids?" The man looked up, his eyes wary but tired. "Yeah," he replied quietly. 3 little boys. They're not doing too well. I'm doing everything I can, but I can't do it alone." Something inside Cassandra stirred as she looked at him. She had no idea why, but she felt drawn to him, as though she understood his struggle in a way she couldn't explain. Her own life had been full of running away from things. Her wedding, her family's expectations, but this was different. This was real. This was something she couldn't ignore. For the first time since she had walked away from everything, Cassandra felt like she had found someone who needed help as much as she did. And in that moment she realized something. Maybe helping someone else was the way to help herself. Cassandra sat back down, her heart racing as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. She had been on her own for so long, trying to figure out what her next step would be. But now suddenly there was this man in front of her, telling her about his children, his struggle. His words were simple but filled with so much raw emotion. He wasn't just talking about hunger or tiredness. He was talking about the fight for his kids' lives. He didn't have anyone to help him, no family to lean on, and the weight of it all seemed to be crushing him. She had only just met him, yet something in his voice, something in the desperate look in his eyes, made her feel like she understood him. She had run away from her own problems, escaping to a life that was uncertain, yet here he was, struggling to hold his family together, trying to survive for the sake of his children. It was hard to ignore the empathy that grew inside her. She knew what it felt like to be lost, to be alone, but she couldn't help feeling like she could do something to help him, just as she had once needed help. For a few moments, she wasn't sure what to say. The words didn't come easily, but eventually she spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "I want to help," she said. Her voice almost surprised her, but she couldn't back down now. This stranger needed something, anything, and she wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew she couldn't leave without doing something. She didn't even know how she was going to help him, but just offering her support, even if only in this moment, seemed like a start. The man looked at her with a mixture of shock and disbelief, as if he couldn't understand why someone like her would want to help someone like him. His gaze softened, but his face still held the deep lines of worry. "Why would you want to help me?" he asked. "I'm just a guy trying to get by. I don't have anything to give you." Cassandra felt her heart go out to him. She could see the pain in his eyes, the weight of his responsibilities. She wasn't sure what she was expecting, but this was more than she could have imagined. He wasn't looking for pity. He wasn't looking for handouts. He was simply looking for a way to survive. "I don't need anything from you," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. I don't know. I feel like I'm supposed to help. Maybe this is the reason I ended up here. Maybe this is the way I can make something right." The man, still uncertain, nodded slowly. He wasn't sure what to make of this, but there was something about the sincerity in her voice that made him trust her. Just for a moment. He seemed to deflate a little, as if the weight on his shoulders had been lightened, even if just by a fraction. "I don't know if I can take anything from you," he murmured, "but I could use some help. I've got 3 kids at home. They're still so small and they're sick. They need medicine, food. I'm doing the best I can, but I don't know how much longer I can keep it together." Cassandra's heart twisted at the mention of his children. Triplets. 3 little boys, struggling in a world that didn't seem to care about them. She could feel her eyes welling up with emotion, but she fought it back. This wasn't about her. This was about them, his family, his children. "I'll help," she said again, her words more certain now. "I'll help however I can." "I can't just walk away from this," the man seemed to hesitate. He looked at her with a strange combination of gratitude and disbelief. It wasn't easy for him to accept help, especially from someone he barely knew, but he didn't have much of a choice. He had to put his pride aside. His children needed him to be strong, and right now his strength was running low. "My name's Noah," he finally said. His voice was quiet, but there was a hint of relief in it now. "And my kids. They're at home just a few miles from here. You don't have to do this. But if you really want to help, I can use all the help I can get." Cassandra nodded, her mind already racing with ideas. She didn't have a lot of money left, but she could figure something out. She didn't know how to help with everything. She wasn't a doctor, and she wasn't a professional in any sense of the word. But what she did know was that Noah needed someone who cared, and she could do that. "I'll come with you," she said, standing up from her seat. "Let's go to your house. I'll see what I can do." Noah looked at her for a long moment, as if he were trying to decide whether this was real. But then, without saying another word, he stood up and they both walked out of the diner together. The sun had fully set by now, and the night was cool and calm. The streets were quiet, and the soft sound of their footsteps echoed in the air. They didn't speak much as they walked. The weight of the situation was heavy, and neither of them had words for it. But the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was a kind of mutual understanding. The kind of silence that happens when 2 people know that words won't be enough to fix things. What was needed now was action. After walking for a few minutes, Noah led her to a small house on the edge of town. It wasn't much, just a tiny 2-bedroom house with a porch and a small yard that looked overgrown. But it was a home, and for Noah and his kids, it was all they had. The door creaked as he opened it, and the faint smell of dust and stale air hit Cassandra's nose. It wasn't the cleanest place, but it had the feeling of a home that had been lived in for a long time. Noah led her inside, and Cassandra's eyes immediately went to the 3 small beds in the corner of the room. 3 cribs, 3 little boys, none of them older than 5, each one lying still, their tiny faces pale. The sight made Cassandra's heart break. She had seen sick children before, but there was something about seeing these 3 little ones, barely old enough to speak, in such a state of weakness that made it hit harder. Noah moved quickly, checking on them, adjusting the blankets. Cassandra stayed back for a moment, just watching, her mind racing with ways she could help. She felt out of place here, unsure of what she could do to make a difference. But as she watched Noah care for his children with such love, she knew that she had to try. She stepped forward, kneeling next to him. "What do they need?" she asked quietly. "How can I help?" Noah looked up, his eyes tired but full of gratitude. They need food. They need medicine. I don't have the money to get them the care they deserve, and I don't know how long I can keep this up. Cassandra didn't hesitate. She already knew what she had to do. She would help him get the food, get the medicine. She would do whatever it took to make sure these children had a chance to survive. She had no idea how she would manage it all, but she wasn't going to leave until she had done everything in her power to help. I'll do what I can, she said firmly, her voice full of purpose. We'll figure this out together. And for the first time in a long time, Cassandra felt like she had a real purpose. Not to run away or hide from her problems, but to face them head on. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but tonight, she was exactly where she needed to be. Cassandra spent the next few hours with Noah, doing her best to help him with his children. It was a world she had never known, a world full of responsibility, exhaustion, and a kind of love she hadn't fully understood before. She had always been so focused on her own needs, her own desires, and her own escape. But now, as she looked at the 3 little boys lying in their cribs, she realized how much bigger the world was than her own problems. The evening had started to slip into night. The house was quiet, save for the faint sound of the children's soft breathing. Noah had managed to settle them, but he was clearly worn out. His face had lines of fatigue that only seemed to deepen as the hours passed. Cassandra could see how much he was carrying, physically, mentally, emotionally. His shoulders slumped, his movements slow, as though every action required a tremendous amount of energy. Noah had been doing everything on his own since his wife's passing, and it was clear that he was barely holding it all together. Cassandra felt her heart ache for him. She knew how it felt to carry the weight of expectations, but this was different. This was a father trying to keep his family alive, trying to be both mother and father to children who needed him in ways that he couldn't fully manage alone. At first, Cassandra had felt a bit out of place, unsure of what role she could play in all this. She had never been a caretaker, and she didn't know the first thing about looking after sick children. But as she spent more time in the house, her natural instincts began to take over. She found herself picking up the smallest one, a little boy named Eli, and holding him gently in her arms. His small body was so frail, and as she rocked him back and forth, she could feel the warmth of his fever radiating through the thin fabric of his pajamas. Noah had stepped into the kitchen to prepare a simple meal, something that would hopefully fill his stomach, even if just for a moment. Cassandra, holding Eli, couldn't help but watch him. There was something so touching about how much he tried to hold on to hope, despite everything. He wasn't giving up, even when it seemed like the world had turned its back on him. After a few minutes, Noah returned to the living room with a plate of food in his hands. He offered it to Cassandra, who took it with a nod of thanks. Though her attention was still on Eli, she could feel the weight of the situation pressing in on her chest, but she didn't want to let it overwhelm her. Not now, not when these children needed her. I've been trying to make it work, Noah said quietly, his voice breaking the silence. But there's only so much I can do. I just don't know how much longer I can keep going. Every day feels like I'm running out of time. Cassandra set the plate down and moved closer to Noah, sitting down beside him. She placed a hand on his arm, offering him a small but reassuring smile. You don't have to do it all alone, she said softly. You don't have to keep carrying all of this by yourself. Noah's eyes flickered with emotion. He had been holding everything inside for so long, trying to manage everything without burdening anyone else. He had never asked for help, had never thought anyone would be willing to offer it. But now, sitting next to Cassandra, he could see the sincerity in her eyes. There was no judgment, no pity, just a woman who was willing to help simply because it was the right thing to do. Thank you, he said, his voice raw with gratitude. I don't know how to say it, but I'm thankful. Cassandra didn't have any grand words to offer him. She didn't have answers to his problems, but she knew what she could do. She could be there. She could offer support. She could take some of the weight off his shoulders, even if just for a moment. As the evening wore on, Cassandra continued to care for the children. She helped Noah get the boys settled in bed, making sure each of them was comfortable and warm. Eli, the youngest, seemed to fall into a deeper sleep, his breathing becoming steadier. The other 2 boys, Jonah and Caleb, were still restless, tossing and turning as they struggled to sleep. Cassandra stayed by their side, gently smoothing their hair or adjusting their blankets. The quiet moments that followed felt oddly peaceful. It was the first time that Cassandra had truly felt present in her life, and for the first time in weeks she wasn't running from something. She wasn't avoiding her problems or pushing them aside. She was facing them head-on, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was doing something important, something that mattered. Noah watched her from the doorway, his expression softening as he saw her care for his children. He had been so focused on trying to keep everything together that he hadn't stopped to think about how much he had been giving up. Cassandra's presence in his home, her willingness to help, was like a breath of fresh air. He hadn't realized how much he needed someone else until now. "I never thought I'd be here," Noah said quietly, his voice full of emotion. "I never thought I'd end up like this, just trying to survive, trying to keep my kids alive. I used to think I had it all figured out. I thought I could do it all on my own." Cassandra looked up at him, meeting his gaze. "No one can do it all alone," she said, her voice calm and reassuring. "We all need someone. Sometimes we just have to accept that help is okay." Noah nodded, his shoulders sagging a little as if a heavy burden had been lifted. He felt a sense of relief wash over him, knowing that for the first time in a long time he didn't have to carry everything by himself. Cassandra had come into his life like a ray of light, offering kindness and understanding when he had expected nothing but more struggles. As the night deepened, the house became quieter. The children were asleep, and Cassandra and Noah were left alone in the living room, the only sound being the occasional creak of the old wooden floor. It was in this stillness that Cassandra felt something shift within her. She had come here to escape, to run from her life, but now she realized that what she had been searching for wasn't a place to hide. It was a place to belong, and in that moment she felt like she belonged here, helping these children, standing beside Noah, offering her support. The weight of her own escape seemed lighter now. It wasn't that her past had disappeared, or that she had all the answers to her own problems. But for the first time in a long while, she wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She was facing her own fears, her own doubts, and she was doing it with someone who needed her. She turned to Noah, offering him a small smile. "We'll figure this out," she said, her voice steady with quiet confidence. "One step at a time." Noah nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He didn't know how things would unfold, but with Cassandra by his side, he knew they could make it through. They weren't alone anymore, and for now that was enough. The days that followed were not easy, but they were filled with hope. Cassandra and Noah had formed an unexpected bond. Every morning she would wake up early, just as the first rays of sunlight began to peek through the dusty curtains of Noah's small house. She would help him with the children, feeding them, giving them their medicine, and cleaning the house. Sometimes she would even just sit with the boys, playing with them, laughing at their innocent jokes, and doing her best to make sure they felt safe. Despite their frailty, Noah was still deeply worried, his mind often consumed by thoughts of how he was going to provide for his children in the long term. Every time he looked at his boys, his heart tightened with fear. They were so young and they needed so much. He knew his resources were running out. He couldn't do it alone. But with Cassandra's help, he was beginning to feel like maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. The mornings began to feel more manageable. The weight of responsibility that had been suffocating Noah began to lift, if only a little. Having Cassandra there, someone who cared, someone who wasn't going to leave, made him feel like he could breathe again. It wasn't just about the help with the children, though that was invaluable. It was the quiet reassurance she provided just by being there. As the weeks went by, things slowly started to improve. Cassandra helped Noah find resources for the children's medicine. She contacted local charities and was able to get donations for food and supplies. While Noah worked long hours, doing whatever odd jobs he could find to make ends meet, Cassandra stayed behind with the boys, looking after them and keeping the house in some semblance of order. She had never imagined her life would turn out like this, helping a man she barely knew, giving up her own plans to be there for others. But somewhere along the way, she stopped feeling like a runaway bride, trying to escape from a life she didn't want. Instead, she began to see herself as someone who was actively building something new, something meaningful. The more she gave, the more she realized how much she had to offer. It wasn't just about the practical help she provided either. It was the emotional support she gave Noah. He had been so closed off for so long, afraid to let anyone in, afraid to ask for help. But as Cassandra stuck by him, he began to open up. They would sit together in the evenings after the kids had gone to bed and talk. Sometimes about trivial things, sometimes about deeper topics. Cassandra learned about Noah's past, the dreams he had before life became a struggle, his hopes for his children, his fear of failing them. Noah learned about Cassandra's life too. He learned about her escape from the wedding, her doubts about the future, and how, in many ways, she was running from herself as much as from her old life. In those quiet moments, surrounded by the sounds of the children sleeping and the hum of the old house, they grew closer. It was as though they had both been running in different directions, but now they had found each other at a time when they both needed someone. The connection between them was unexpected, but it was undeniable. Neither of them had planned for it. But sometimes life had a way of leading people to exactly where they needed to be, even if it was in the most unexpected of ways. As the weeks turned into months, Noah's children grew stronger. The fever that had once plagued them slowly faded. Their laughter, once weak and barely audible, began to fill the small house again. They were still fragile, still needing careful attention, but they were no longer in immediate danger. Cassandra's care had made a difference. She had been their steady presence when Noah couldn't always be there, and now the boys were starting to thrive. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. And with every little improvement in the children's health, Noah's hope grew. He had started to believe that maybe they had a future after all. He had once thought that this was it, that his life was just a series of setbacks, one after another, that there was no way to overcome the challenges that life had thrown at him. But now, with Cassandra by his side, he was starting to see things differently. Maybe there was a way out of the darkness. Maybe they could create a life together, a life filled with love, laughter, and hope. One evening, as the sun was setting and the air began to cool, Cassandra found herself standing in front of the small house, watching the children play in the yard. The sky was painted with shades of orange and pink, and the peaceful scene made her feel something she hadn't felt in a long time: contentment. Noah came up beside her, and together they watched the kids play. For a long time, neither of them said anything. There didn't need to be words. Everything was clear. "I don't know how to thank you," Noah said finally, his voice full of gratitude. "You saved us, Cassandra. You really did." Cassandra turned to look at him, her heart swelling. She had never thought of herself as someone who could save anyone. She had been running away from her own life for so long, trying to escape, trying to find answers. But now, looking at the family she had helped, she realized that she hadn't just saved them. In some ways, they had saved her too. "You don't need to thank me," she said softly. I think I was running from something I didn't even understand. But being here with you and your boys, I think I've found something real, something that matters." Noah looked at her with a softness in his eyes. He knew what she meant. He had been running from his own fears, his own doubts, and now he was starting to believe that life had more to offer than he had ever imagined. They both stood there for a while longer, watching the children, knowing that their lives had changed in ways they couldn't have predicted. The future was still uncertain, but it no longer felt so daunting. Together they had started something new, and whatever came next, they would face it together. For the first time in a long time, Cassandra felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She hadn't just found a family in Noah and his boys. She had found herself. And as the evening sun dipped lower, casting a golden glow over the yard, Cassandra knew one thing for certain: her story wasn't over. It was only just beginning.